Well, if all you want to do is survive, your needs are pretty basic: food, shelter, and clothing, right? And really, clothing is could be considered optional in some scenarios. Beyond those essentials, I think our needs really depend on our emotional makeup and our goals, and those differ from person to person. One person's needs are going to be different than another person's needs. And wants. Wants are different too. If you want to get real involved in it, real deep into the subject, there's always Maslow's chart of needs. But I'm no psychologist, so these are just going to be my thoughts and opinions on the subject. Before I made my lifestyle change back in the 90s, I was highly into accumulation mode. I was working quite a bit and making a decent wage, single, living by myself. So I was was doing my part to support the economy, put it that way. I was going to rescue the economy all by myself. When I decided to make the move to the UP and start my homesteading adventure, my goals changed, so my needs changed along with them. So what I did was I knew I was going to be living off grid and electricity was going to be at a premium, so I divested of all my electrical equipment. Anything that ran on electricity, I should say most things that ran on electricity, I got rid of before I made the move. My needs, my goals changed, so my needs changed. And let's say I made a few mistakes along the way too. Got rid of some things I should have kept and kept some things that I didn't need. Making a physical move like that is a good way of decluttering. You have a tendency to get rid of things you don't need or you think you won't need. And I did that. And like I said, I made a few mistakes. And then when I left the UP to move to northern Wisconsin to be closer to my aging parents, I made a few more mistakes in my decluttering and my downsizing. I had accumulated while I was in the UP, accumulated different things. And moving from off grid to back on grid, my goals changed and my needs changed again. And like I said, I made some more mistakes. I went from 240 acres with a 2-bedroom house with a full basement and a 30 by 50 barn to a 650 square foot house on 5 acres with a small shed. And I can remember sitting at my kitchen table looking out the window thinking to myself, everything I own in the world is sitting right here on this little plot in Wisconsin. And then I got to thinking, awful lot of people probably could say the same thing. Not everyone, but a lot of people. Everything they own is in a pretty small area. Then I got feeling guilty about that because a lot of people don't have that small plot. A lot of people didn't have what I had. A lot of people, all they have is what's on their back. You know, think of all the homeless people there are in the world, in the country, in the world. All they have is what's on their back and in their shopping cart. And then I started feeling guilty, feeling sorry for myself. But that didn't last too long. It doesn't usually last too long. I'm pretty thankful for everything I have, regardless of my situation. And my emotional needs changed as well. I went from a long-term relationship that ended rather abruptly to being the primary caregiver for my aging parents. And when I moved to Wisconsin, my parents were doing pretty well, but where they were headed was pretty obvious. You know, they weren't getting any younger. It was a pretty interesting time, to say the least. And usually when talking about wants and needs, the first thought is to stuff, you know, material things. That's pretty easy to categorize and pretty easy to get your hands around, get your mind around. What's a little bit slippery is the emotional and the spiritual needs that we have. That's not quite so easy to define and put a finger on. And those needs can change abruptly and then change back abruptly. I think the emotional needs of people can vary quite a bit from person to person. And I think that's where a lot of relationships go sideways, is not being able to recognize the emotional needs of other people. But like I said, I'm no psychologist, so there you go. And here's a question for you to ponder. Would you rather be needed or wanted in a relationship? Give that some thought. Leave your thoughts down in the comments if you want to. Would you rather be needed or wanted? So anyway, getting back to the material end of the conversation, we just had a visit from some friends who were just ending a anchorless touring of the United States. Kind of an odd way to put that, I think. What they had done about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, was to sell almost everything they had. They sold their houses, sold all their furniture, furnishings, everything like that, and went on a tour around the country. And they covered the four corners of the country, north, south, east, and west. And they did that in a car pulling a small trailer. The small trailer, it's kind of a funny story. They told me they towed a motorcycle trailer around with the car, had a hitch put on the car, and they towed a motorcycle trailer around. And I had in my mind a large enclosed trailer that you would put a motorcycle or two in to tow the motorcycle somewhere. Well, what they were talking about was a trailer that you would pull behind a motorcycle. Whole different ball game. Whole different size. We're talking about the size of a couple of good-sized suitcases. So that's what they had in their possession for the past year or so, was what they could put in their car and in this small motorcycle trailer. And they, like I said, toured the country. They would stay basically 2 months at a location and then move somewhere else, stay a couple months there, move somewhere else, stay a couple months there. And they had gotten to the point recently where they decided that they wanted to have someplace to call home again. So they bought a house in Tennessee, not too far from here actually. But they were closing in on the end of their vagabond journey, which I thought was pretty cool. And I've recently become aware of a lifestyle trend that seems to be growing in popularity, or maybe I'm just becoming more aware of it, I don't know. But it's referred to as the van life. And there's this group of people, growing group of people, I think, that are living in their vans, traveling around just living in their vans. And that's all their possessions are what they have in their van. That's a pretty interesting lifestyle to me. You could look it up on YouTube if you're interested. Just type in van life and you'll come up with a whole bunch of YouTube channels about living out of a van. And that's done in a lot of different ways. Some of them are pretty elaborate. I mean, you'd have to have a pretty good stake moving into it. And some of them are more out of necessity. So it's interesting. If you're interested in that, you can find all kinds of stuff on it on YouTube. Like everything else, you can find anything on YouTube. Being a child of the 60s and 70s, I can't help but be reminded of the hippie van era. Remember the converted school buses that the hippies had? That was always interesting to me too. I was always just a little bit envious of the folks that were doing that. I call it vagabonding, and it has a strange appeal to me. To be perfectly honest about it, I think I would need someplace to call home. I would need someplace to go back to from time to time. I don't know. And in that same vein, how about living on a boat? I always thought I could live on a boat. A sailboat that you could live on and that would be home. I don't know if I'd feel the same way about having to have a land-based place to call home or not. But I always thought I could live on a boat. That would sure cut down on the clutter. There wouldn't be a lot of extra room for stuff on a boat. And how about tiny houses? It's become a pretty popular thing of late. I think I could live in a tiny house. I would, like I said, I would certainly, like a boat, would cut down on your possessions. I think I could do that. At least with a tiny house, there'd be a place to stay, a place to call home, a plot of land somewhere, a lot somewhere, something. What do you think about living a smaller lifestyle if you're not doing that already? If you are, I'd love to hear about it. If you're not, but have some thoughts on it, I'd love to hear that too. Leave them down in the comments. Like I said before, I love reading the comments, how other people feel about these things. So please, feel free to leave a comment. I think most of us like a certain amount of stuff. And I do the stuff, things, possessions, material things. I think most of us like a certain amount of that. We have different interests, but whatever our interests are, we tend to accumulate some. I like technology. I like my computers. I like my cameras. Do I need all the cameras I have? No, definitely. Do I need all the computers I have? No, I don't. Could I get by without them? Absolutely. But I like them. Nothing wrong with that. I think most of us could get by with less. Whatever our interests are, whatever our situation is, we could get by with less than we have. Most of us. Before we came to North Carolina full time, we traveled seasonally between Wisconsin and North Carolina. Summers in Wisconsin and winters in North Carolina. And that, at the time, that seemed like a desirable thing to do, have two places. And if you've ever spent a winter in northern Wisconsin, you probably have had that thought at some point. It's nice to get away from the long winters of Wisconsin. And it was fun, and we enjoyed it. But it didn't take very long to realize that having two places like that, when we were in Wisconsin, I was thinking about all the things that needed to be done down here in North Carolina. And when we came down to North Carolina in the winter, I was thinking about all the things that were happening up at our place in Wisconsin. You know, are the pipes freezing? How deep is the snow? Is there too much snow on the roof? That kind of thing. When we decided to move full-time to North Carolina and sold our place in Wisconsin, it was a huge weight off my shoulders. Huge. Now I can relax in North Carolina and not worry about what's happening in Wisconsin. There's definitely something to be said for downsizing. There's a certain amount of responsibility that goes along with ownership. You know, whether it's another house or property or cars, motorcycles, whatever it is. You have the responsibility of maintenance and repairs and insurance and the liabilities of it all. Plus that feeling that you have this and you ought to be using it. When you aren't using it, you feel like you ought to be using it if you have it. If you know what I'm trying to say. Downsizing, liquidating, decluttering has a very liberating effect. The less you have, the less you have to worry about or to think about. There's something to be said for that. And I think one of the dangerous things about this want, need, want discussion is the feeling that you need something in order to be happy. That's pretty dangerous. And I would suggest that it's seldom true, you know, the feeling that if I only had whatever it is, that I'd be happy. And I think that's not often the case, because once you attain that thing that's supposed to make you happy, there's always something else. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting something just because you want it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the problem comes in when you want something and you convince yourself that you need it. I think that's the dangerous part. The thinking that you need something when really you just want it. You can trust me on this. I have some experience in that. Now, at this stage of my life, I'm pretty content with where I am and what I have. I've said that any number of times. But I think being content with what you have doesn't mean there's anything wrong with wanting more or wanting something else just for the sake of wanting it. I mean, my needs are pretty well met. That doesn't mean I don't have a desire for something now and then. Okay, more than now and then. You know, ambition isn't a bad thing necessarily. It can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. And our wants and needs change with our ambitions and our goals. There's nothing wrong with that either, inherently. It can become a problem, but it doesn't have to. I think the key, the main thing is to keep a distinction between wants and needs. I'm a very fortunate guy. At this point in my life, my needs are pretty well met. I have everything that I really need. I don't say that in a bragging way. I say that in a grateful way. I'm a very fortunate person. I have all the food, shelter, and clothing I need. And my spiritual and emotional needs are in pretty good shape. Most of what I'm dealing with now is wants. That's a pretty good place to be. And I'm grateful for it. And with Christmas being just a few short days away, I'd like to offer you a poem along with my thanks for being here. Peace, joy, and Merry Christmas.